The dark origins of reborn dolls. Tweak 2, trauma therapy? You've seen a reborn baby doll. Those eerily realistic dolls that look like they're sleeping, breathing, even holding a soul behind their eyes. With hand-painted skin, visible veins, and individually rooted eyelashes, for some, they're collectibles, for others, a form of therapy. But what you probably don't know is that the origins of these dolls go far beyond modern artistry and straight into one of the darkest periods in human history, World War II. Imagine holding a baby so lifelike, so intricately detailed, that your brain momentarily forgets it's not alive. The gentle weight in your arms, the delicate creases on its skin, even the faint blush of warmth in its cheeks. Everything feels real. But it isn't. Those eerily realistic dolls that look like they're sleeping, breathing, even holding a soul behind their eyes. With hand-painted skin, visible veins, and individually rooted eyelashes. So how did this movement begin? Who are the people behind these creations? Let's dive into a story that's as heartwarming as it is uncanny. This is a story about grief, war, and the desperate attempt to replace the irreplaceable. During World War II, the world turned into a graveyard of emotions. It wasn't just the bombs that shattered cities. It was the silence that followed after they fell. Silence in the streets. Silence in the homes, and, most hauntingly, silence in the arms of mothers who no longer had a child to hold. In countries like England and Germany, the psychological impact of war on women was devastating. Thousands of mothers lost children to bombings, disease, hunger. Many others simply never found out what happened to their children. Missing soldiers behind enemy lines, evacuated kids who never came back. And it was in that void of anguish that something began to take shape. Not in a laboratory, but in a primal need to fill the empty space left behind. The idea that an object, a doll, could offer, even for a few seconds, relief from that unbearable emptiness. These weren't toys, they were survival tools, emotional crutches made of cloth, glass, and grief. Reports from the time mention widows sewing tiny clothes for dolls just to maintain a sense of sanity. Mothers who never got a body to bury slept every night with a doll in their arms. It was grief without closure. And when there's no grave, absence becomes a haunting presence. This behavior caught the attention of military psychologists. In England, post-war studies documented how traumatized women, especially those who lost children during the London Blitz, began using dolls in an almost ritualistic, therapeutic way. What started as play became survival. By the 1950s, this behavior had a name in psychiatric literature: grief substitution objects. But no one talked about it. Society wasn't ready. In the ruins of post-war Germany, some toy workshops slowly resumed operations, but materials were scarce, military fabrics were recycled, shattered windows became eyes, and something changed in those dolls. They became heavier, more human-like. Their features softened, their proportions began to mimic real babies. So the world moved on. It wasn't until the 1990s in the United States that the term reborn doll started circulating among collectors. At first, artists simply modified existing dolls to make them look more real, with layered paint, weighted limbs, hand-rooted hair. But what began as art quickly became refuge. Women who had lost children through miscarriage, stillbirth, death, or forced adoption began acquiring these dolls for comfort. And psychiatrists noticed something. It worked. While controversial, the effects were real. Reduced anxiety, fewer depressive episodes, and even better sleep. These weren't toys anymore. They were returning to their original purpose, helping people survive the unbearable. And that brings us full circle. Could it be that Reborn dolls are direct descendants of WWII grief dolls. In 1939, the world plunged into chaos. World War II erupted with thunderous force, pulling millions into a vortex of violence and death. Cities burned, families were separated, and lives were lost on an unimaginable scale. But amid the fire and smoke, not every casualty was a soldier. Children became collateral damage, both physically and emotionally. In bombed-out homes and refugee camps, the smallest victims carried the heaviest grief. Across Europe, war disrupted every aspect of life. But in the quiet corners, where radios whispered news of fallen cities and fathers who would never return, mothers did what they could to preserve a sense of normalcy. In Britain, where the Blitz raged nightly over London, women huddled in underground shelters with their children, clinging to anything that reminded them of peace. And sometimes, that reminder came in the form of a doll. Before the term reborn existed, war mothers had already begun creating their own versions. In London during the early 1940s, a nurse named Edith Holloway worked in a children's hospital near Paddington Station. She had seen unspeakable injuries, but nothing haunted her more than the emotional void in the eyes of orphaned children. One day, she stumbled upon an idea that would change everything, using scraps from bombed fabric factories, old stockings, cotton, and even soot-tinted wax. She began crafting dolls for the children under her care. But Edith did more than sew fabric. She recreated the likeness of their lost siblings or playmates. She hand-painted faces from memory, added button eyes and woolen hair, even weighted them with sand to give them the familiar heft of a real infant. The dolls weren't beautiful. They were raw, unsettling even. But they sparked something in the children, a flicker of comfort, a memory of home. Edith's dolls caught the attention of others in the medical field. Psychologists working with war orphans noticed something remarkable. The dolls weren't just toys, they were therapy. Children who had withdrawn into silence began to speak again. They held the dolls during nightmares, during meals, during therapy sessions. The British government, desperate for tools to mitigate the emotional devastation of the war, began quietly supporting a small, unofficial program. Codenamed Project Hearth, the initiative commissioned dozens of female artists and nurses to produce these dolls for refugee camps and temporary orphanages. Each doll was unique. Some had the names of lost siblings sewn into their cloth. Others were modeled after missing children, created from surviving photographs or the descriptions of grieving parents. These dolls were never mass-produced. They were crafted with intent, with grief, with love. Unbeknownst to the British, something similar was happening across the Channel. In occupied France, a woman named Claire Moreau, a sculptor from Marseille, began creating dolls from clay and wax to distract children from the gunfire outside. Her dolls were astonishingly realistic, sometimes too much so. According to wartime journals, a German officer once mistook one of Claire's creations for a real child and tried to arrest her for hiding a fugitive. It was only after inspecting the doll that he realized his error. He left. Shaken Claire's work spread throughout the French resistance network. Her dolls became symbols of hope and protection. Mothers would hide messages inside them. Some even concealed maps or photographs within their fabric torsos. The art of lifelike doll making had become, unintentionally, a silent act of rebellion. When the war ended in 1945, most of these wartime dolls were forgotten. Some were burned with old belongings, others were buried with the children who never made it home. But a few survived. In the 1950s and 60s, collectors began stumbling upon these unusual dolls at estate sales and war museums. They noted the realism, the craftsmanship, the haunting eyes that seemed to hold a century of sorrow. A few artists, inspired by the forgotten works of Edith and Claire, began replicating the style. One such artist, an American named Martha Peterson, discovered one of Claire's dolls in a Paris flea market in 1962. The doll was worn, its face partially melted, but it bore an uncanny human quality. Martha returned to the US and began experimenting. Using new materials, vinyl, silicone, glass eyes, she sought to recreate that same aura. By the 1990s, her work had influenced an entire underground community. The term Reborn was finally coined, describing dolls that had been taken from commercial models and transformed into lifelike infants. But few knew the history that had inspired them. Today, Reborn dolls are a multi-million-dollar industry. Artists spend hundreds of hours creating each doll, sometimes charging thousands for a single piece. They are used in therapy for grieving mothers, in dementia care for elderly patients, and even as props in film and photography. But there's a growing movement to reconnect the art form with its roots. Museums in London and Paris have begun showcasing wartime dolls alongside modern reborns, illustrating the emotional lineage that links them. Some contemporary reborn artists have taken it a step further. They model dolls after archival photographs from World War II. They craft replicas of Edith's hospital dolls or Claire's wax sculptures. It's not about profit, it's about remembrance. Look closely, and the parallels are impossible to ignore. Handcrafted creation, emotional purpose, origin in trauma, and silence wrapped around them like a shroud. Because even today, much of what we know comes from whispers, not history books. There were no documentaries, no hashtags, just silence. The kind of silence that clings to unspoken grief. The kind of silence war doesn't destroy, it just transfers. In a small, nearly forgotten museum in southern Germany, there's a wing filled with handmade dolls from 1944 to 1946. Some have cracked glass eyes, some wear tiny military uniforms, some have names embroidered onto their chests, like miniature gravestones. In Poland, Red Cross documents mention dolls sent to refugee camps, not as toys, but as psychological lifelines. Some of these dolls were later found with photographs of dead children tucked inside their hollow torsos. In England, early therapists wrote letters, now buried in archives, describing women who brought their dolls into sessions of hypnosis and regression therapy, and wept as if cradling their real children. Today, reborn dolls are sold under bright lights, with names like Ava or Liam, priced at thousands of dollars. But for those who know the real story, there's always a lingering discomfort, as if each stroke of paint hides another layer of pain. Maybe, without even realizing, modern artists are continuing a silent tradition born in the chaos of war. Maybe, when they sculpt the peaceful expression of a reborn, they're also sculpting a muffled scream, a buried memory, an absence that never truly left. And if all of this still sounds exaggerated to you, try to look at it this way. What's more disturbing, a doll that looks like a real baby, or a world where mothers bury their children and are expected to carry on as if nothing happened? Maybe reborn dolls aren't about realism. Maybe they're about survival, about denying the end, even if only for a few precious seconds. World War II showed us the depths of human cruelty, but it also revealed the strange, desperate ways we cope with pain that no medicine can reach. And if, in the middle of ruins, rubble, and empty arms, someone found the idea of holding a doll just to stay sane, then maybe the question isn't why. Maybe it's, how did we survive all of this without something like that? Next time you see one, look closer. Behind the glassy eyes and lifelike skin lies a legacy of survival, a tribute to children who were lost, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans find a way to create life again, if only in the form of a doll. That is the untold story of the reborn baby, born not in a factory, but in the rubble of war.